So all heat pumps have to defrost. The reason for this is the outdoor coil, in order to absorb heat from the outside air, must be colder than the outside air. So with the coil being usually below freezing, any moisture that is in the air will collect on the fins of the coil and will cause frost and ice to form. So the heat pump on the left with the bands of frost is normal. During the winter, most heat pumps will have a frost band like this, but it shouldn't get any worse than this. If your heat pump looks like the one on the right, you have a problem and you need to troubleshoot your defrost cycle. In most of our heat pump classes, we always talk about location, where to put the heat pump. We always say you don't want to put it directly under a bedroom window, as the people will hear it running and probably will object to the noise. One of the considerations with a heat pump is when units are put under an overhang of the roof, you need to make sure that the heat pump is not in a place where ice, if it forms on the roof, will fall off into the heat pump. So two things could happen. Rain could run off the roof and go into the heat pump and cause extra moisture that would cause the heat pump to freeze up. And a normal heat pump cycle, defrost cycle, would not be able to clear that kind of moisture. The other thing I've seen happen is that icicles like this can break off and fall into the heat pump and puncture the coil. And then you have a real problem. So make sure when you're placing the heat pump on the pad at the house that you consider all of these options and make sure the heat pump is not in danger of excessive moisture or icicles falling through the top grill. If you've been working for any amount of time in the field, you'll probably recognize this old Paragon Timer. This is how they used to initiate the defrost cycle. It was simply a timer, a clock, which went around for 30 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever the time limit was set. And when the time clock would come around to the time that it was set at, it would then put the heat pump into the defrost cycle. So today, everything is solid state, of course. And so now the Paragon timer has been replaced by a solid state timer board, and it works on time and temperature. So most of your defrost boards have a setting that you can set the time interval for 30, 60, 90, or 120 minutes. Now that time is accumulated compressor runtime. So it doesn't mean that every 30 minutes it's going to go into defrost. It means that once the timer has accumulated 30 minutes of compressor runtime, then it will check the defrost switch, which is mounted on the outdoor coil. And if this switch is closed, then the board will put the heat pump into defrost. So this is the click-on type switch for a defrost switch on a heat pump. This switch is mounted on the outdoor coil, and when the defrost board times out for 30 minutes or whatever the setting is, if this switch is closed, the defrost board will put the unit into defrost. If the switch is open, the timer will reset and look again for another 30 minutes. One thing to keep in mind with this type of switch, since the switch is total metal, there are times when this switch may short to ground. So if you're having a low voltage fuse blowing on a heat pump system, this is one spot that you want to double check and make sure that this defrost switch is not grounded out to the condenser coil. On most of your modern heat pumps today, the click-on type switch has been replaced by thermistors. These are resistance temperature devices that do the same thing as a switch, that when the coil reaches a certain temperature, it will either go shorted or open, telling the board that it's time for a defrost cycle. All of your thermistors that sense temperature for outside air or coil temperature are 10K resistance thermistors. That means that at 77 degrees, the resistance that you would read on this thermistor would be 10,000 ohms. That's why we call them a 10K resistance value. So when you're troubleshooting these thermistors, keep that in mind, and there are these charts that are available that tell you at what temperature your outside air is, what your thermistor should be reading, so you can properly diagnose a bad sensor. So here's a tech tip that I learned a couple of years ago. We had a technician who was working on a carrier heat pump, and he replaced the coil temperature sensor, he replaced the defrost board, and he replaced these items a couple of times and did everything he could. He checked the charge, he checked everything that he could think of, but he would not be able to get the heat pump to go into a defrost mode. So he finally called me out to the job site to see if he was missing something. I went over everything with him, and when we were at the end of what we could think of, I called the factory. The guy at the factory said, "Have you checked out the model plug?" So on a lot of heat pumps, there is a model plug on the control board which tells the unit what size unit it is, and so therefore it knows how to operate as far as CFM and RPMs. The guy at the factory said, "Ohm out the resistors that are on the model plug." We did so, and one of the resistors was way out of range. The guy at the factory said, "Well, there's your problem. That resistor is telling the heat pump that it is not a heat pump, but it is a straight air conditioner. So therefore, the unit will never go into defrost." So the technician I was with lived not too far away from the job site, and he was a radio buff, electronic guy. So he took the model plug to his house and replaced the resistor and brought it back. And as soon as we put the new model plug back in with the new resistor, the unit went into a defrost immediately. So if you have a heat pump that is not defrosting and you've checked everything, the control board, the temperature sensor, the charge, and it still won't go into defrost, if your heat pump has a model plug on it, check out the resistors on that model plug. The value of the resistors is always listed on the wiring diagram. And if any of those resistors are out of range, that could be your problem.
Go to arefco.com for more videos, like, subscribe, and check back every week for new videos.